Good afternoon, everyone. So my topic is actually based on a very specific study that was actually procured by an international organization. To be more specific, by Asia Pacific NGO network that are trying to lobby the Chinese new investments bank, like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank and stuff like that. So I'm not going to talk about the research too much, but I will try to weave this research, the specific research, into my general framework research and try to talk about governance in Mongolia with the focus on environmental governance. Ooh, too many slides. So the methodology is just any basic research that is based on desk studies, some interviews, and a couple of field works. So my theoretical lens, which I'm starting this talk, is I'm taking from Michel Foucault, the French philosopher that was very popular in mid-20th century. According to Foucault, governmentality, as well as neoliberal governmentality, was focused as he defined it as particular form of post-welfare state politics in which the state essentially outsources the responsibility of ensuring the well-being of the population to third parties. So this is my starting theoretical point, which could be modified and configured during my speech. So what is the primary subject in this neoliberal governmentality model? The primary subject is the citizen. It's the rational individual that decides by his dollars or by his votes different old aspects of different governmental functions as well as economic policy and connected policies. So I will talk a little bit about the social legacy of Mongolia that is still affecting the current governance model in Mongolia right now. So one of the main points is that the socialist constitutional and governmental order was included of provision of social goods and thus combined characteristics of a welfare state as well as a disciplinary state, which is very, very similar to late development countries like South Korea and Japan, that it involves some aspects of developmental state as well as some authoritarian state. So the ruling party, the main party, Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, was the main party, and the party's rules and procedures was actually the more fundamental part of the constitutional order compared to the de jure constitution. Basically, it was the de facto constitution, the MPRP rules and procedures. So it will rear its ugly head in 90s and 2000s. So what are the trends in environmental governance? Up until the 70s, most countries, including Mongolia and socialist bloc countries, didn't have that, this unified environmental governance and laws particular to it. They largely let companies work without requiring them to prevent or clean up pollution. So that was basically the main modus operandi of those states as well as companies. And then after the 70s and 80s, the paradigm itself shifted from polluter suffers to the polluter pays principle, which basically means that if you pollute, you will pay later for any damages to the environment. So governments have started to actually experience with different types of environmental governance. So, for example, the previous model was itself concerned with strict regulations that would just define in the laws the standards of how, for example, mining companies should operate, the very, very strict standards. After late 70s and 80s, the governance framework started to become more flexible and more market-based. So this is called performance standards, and the decision on how to mitigate pollution or environmental damage was left to companies itself. So thus allowing space for technological innovation as well as more conflict of interest. So I will come up with a little example of this case called biodiversity offsets, which was introduced in Mongolia about 5-6 years ago. So there was this environmental scholar from Netherlands, and we went to South Gobi on a fact-finding mission, and he was very, very perplexed that Mongolia was the second country in the world to actually legislate biodiversity offsets into national legislation. And we went to interview about 40 different people in government and agencies, and nobody knew what it was. So this is, and the biodiversity offsets is basically means the mining companies, for example, the modus operandi should be, first of all, the bottom one. If it's possible, need to avoid any damages, right? And then, of course, if it's possible, minimize. And then if it's cannot minimize, you have to rehabilitate or restore. And then if everything goes bonkers, you do this type of stuff called offset. But what it basically means is that, okay, I'm not going to again mention a mining company. Okay, construction company. Okay, they would just dig up a ground and just produce an irreparable damage to an environment. So what can basically do by this biodiversity offset clause is they can just go to South Gobi, bring a plant from there, plant in that area where they destroyed it, and it said it's offsetting because they're just replacing with whatever it's possible. So this is just this case of flexible management that I was talking about that is left to companies. So there are like many governance indicators that actually try to define and qualify Mongolia's governance. We probably know the most popular ones like economic freedom, economic diversity, ease of doing business, and stuff like that. So these are mostly pro-business rankings that are pro-investor rankings that investors look at and decide whether they would approach a country or not. So another performance index is this environmental performance index produced in collaboration with NASA, I think. So in this, basically, Mongolia ranks about 116th country in the scale from 170 countries. So another very, very pertinent index is environmental democracy index, which comes close to our today's talk, which actually tries to qualify environmental governance by 3 different criteria. First is access to information. You can see 1.67, and then you can see public participation and access to justice. And most post-socialist countries usually rank very well on the bottom criteria, access to justice. And they usually lag behind on the top 2 criteria. So transparency is kind of good to average, participation is fair, which is below average, and justice good, which is below average. So I will talk a little bit about country safeguard systems. These policies of international financial institutions refers to a country's legal and institutional framework, consisting of its national, subnational, or sector implementing institutions and relevant laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that pertain to the safeguard policy. So basically, this multinational financial institution like Asian Development Bank requires all of its projects to this kind of assessments. So as I've told before, Mongolians usually, this was the story from 1990s. We tried to import different types of indexes like this or requirements like this, and then try to assess our governance, which is quite problematic. That I will show you later. So more specifically, these country safeguard systems include laws, regulations, rules, and procedures on the policy areas of environment, involuntary resettlement, and indigenous peoples safeguards. As you can see, these are very, very particular points, right? Indigenous peoples, involuntary resettlement, that was developed during the 1970s, which was used in post-colonial societies because most post-colonial societies actually diverged this very artificial point between indigenous people that were before them and the settlers that came after that. So it's very, very specific to different Latin American countries, and sometimes it's quite not applicable to countries like Mongolia. So, of course, part of this country safeguard systems analysis is assessment of the national legislation, starting from the constitution and continuing from the constitution to the main law on environment that is called the Law on Environmental Protection, and then corresponding laws that regulate different aspects of environmental regulation, like Law on Environmental Impact Assessments that is used by the country system safeguards and used by different international financial organizations as well as investors. So, as I said before, since 1990s, the whole new system was implemented and implanted in Mongolia, which includes over 30 environmental laws as well as several hundred environmental regulations and bylaws. So, the country system safeguard system was actually, how do you call it in English? It was put into the national legislations like the Law on Environmental Protection, and because of that, the Article 7 requires the conduct of natural resource assessment and environmental impact assessments, which I will talk about later. So these are international treaties and protocols that Mongolia ratified or entered or ascended, which is quite numerous. So the basic point of this country safeguard system is to this environmental impact assessment procedure. So why is this so important? Like any project, be it construction, rural, utility, gear area development, mining, any project should do this environmental impact assessment thing. And this is the primary criteria that evaluates this, the mitigation part of the different projects. So EIA provides the environmental baseline before the start of the project, evaluates the likely impact of the project, and proposes how impacts are to be monitored and how are they to be mitigated. So a typical EA that a project would submit is, A, would be description of the project, then alternatives to this project, then environmental baseline study, identification and evaluation of likely impacts, monitoring plan, and environmental management plan. So I will not go too deeply into this. So basically this looks like this, the whole procedure. So any big project that applies have to do this. So this is very, very ugly graphic that I put up this morning. I apologize for that. So basically, there is a screening process, and if the ministry approves the project, it goes on. If it doesn't approve, then there are two options. Either a company is absolutely rejected, or it is rejected with some qualifications that they could fulfill later. So it's a very, very complicated process. And there are also assessment mechanisms like cumulative and strategic environmental assessment. So basically, strategic environmental assessment is used when a project, the implications of the project are so big in scale and scope. For example, the Shurungol Dam at the Silinga River and stuff like that would necessarily require something like this, strategic environmental assessment. So basically, my study was made very easy because actually the Asian Environmental Compliance and Enforcement Network did a comparative analysis of EIA compliance of 16 member countries. So there are about about 15, 17 reservations that they came up with weaknesses, and basically every single one of them applies to Mongolia. The more serious ones are like inadequate consideration of alternatives during the EIA process, and late timing, loopholes in the lists, lack of data, systematic underestimation of costs that would just always rears its ugly head at the middle phase of the project or at the end of the project and stuff like that. So we did also some cross-country comparisons with more comparable countries like Laos, PDR, Thailand, and Cambodia. So Mongolia actually ranks in these formal stipulations very, very high in the region as well as among the developing countries. If there is a treaty, Mongolia is in. If there is a standard, Mongolia is in. So the openness comes with both weaknesses and, of course, strengths. So after the environmental impact assessment comes the next part, which is community consultation and public participation part, which is probably the main part that multinational, especially mining companies, are using around the world. So it is seen as the community consultation and public participation is mostly seen by big multinationals as a risk mitigating mechanism, that if they can mitigate the social and conflict risks at the local level, they won't have to actually negotiate with the state level at the capital level. So this is, seen from this angle, it's, so for example, Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration states that environmental issues are best handled with participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. So there are like also mandates by Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development, which also states that making consultation with affected stakeholders a requirement of the permitting process and at every stage of the mining cycle. So this is pretty much a gold standard right now. So Mongolia enacted lots from this recommendations, like for example, Mongolia amended its law on environmental impact assessment in 2012. So major changes to EIA procedures included requirement to consult with local residents affected by the project, to develop an environmental management plan, consult with also the local residents, and report on EMP's implementation to local communities and governments. So Mongolia's law on EIA also ensures some rights of consultation. So here comes the problem. All of these statements and principles are enacted into the laws, but they are mostly very, very, very general, and they are not backed up by specific regulations as well as procedures. It was probably in 70% of cases something like this. So this is just a little example. So for example, even though the law on EIA has provisions calling for public involvement, critical things remain absent. For example, there is no definition of the public, nor is it clear how these suggestions will be reflected of the assessment, or what kind of public opinion will be taken into consideration. So it's in a very, very abstract and general sense enacted, these principles. So the criteria and the benchmark to actually assess this consultation and participation is called meaningful consultation. So according to these gold standard benchmarks, any meaningful consultation or participation should involve, it should begin early, it should be carried out on an ongoing basis, it should provide timely disclosure of relevant and adequate information, it should be undertaken in an atmosphere free of intimidation or coercion, it should be gender inclusive and responsive, and it should enable the incorporation of all relevant views of the affected people. So if you see this from this very content-based and substantial type of benchmark and compare it with Mongolian legislation, it's kind of night and day. So I will just skip some of this and go to this. Sometimes policymakers and development policy specialists do this type of, they have this formula and they try to enact it everywhere they come. This is called like a cookie cutter approach. Yeah? Everywhere is the same gloves type of approach. So this nukurulur, which is in English, is approximates something like management communities, were enacted in environmental laws. So in theory, what it should do, these management communities, is they should be, how do you call that? Defenders of their local nature reservations. And they should be helped by the state in processes of like monitoring them, monitoring different operations and stuff like that. But what happened in reality is that Nukurlus became the institutionalized form of ninja, ninja Mongolia, the artisanal miners. So what they do in practice is that any 5 person from any locality, for example, a Som, can go to administrative office at some level or the governor and apply for this Nukurlu stamp. And then they could do some artisanal mining, which is usually left by big mining company, which didn't perform their closure operations properly. And they, with this little license and stamp, go into different leftover mining like pits and stuff like that, and they do work. So it's kind of, right now it has become totally unregulatable, if there is English word like that. And then it's just so much, giving so much problems to both regulators and mining companies also. So in terms of public information disclosure, for example, we reviewed 10 laws, and right to obtain information from relevant government institutions is present in 7. An obligation to provide accurate information is present in only 6. Even in those 6 laws, exceptionally vague provisions such as shall be made accessible and may be accessible without procedures on exactly when, which entity should provide what kind of information, using what channels and platforms is prevalent, which means totally absent. So I will come up with another example. So for example, law on company confidentiality refuses to extend secrecy to operations of companies that could affect public health and environment. So for example, a very, very big mining company could exploit this loophole because mineral law contradicts the company's secrecy law. Why it contradicts? Because the minerals law explicitly contradicts this by allowing the state-administered body to treat reports of exploration work, information with respect to mine operations and feasibility studies prepared by a license holder as the license holder's confidential information during the valid period of the license. So due to this fact, public has been unable to get accurate information on most major mining operations. It's just treated as a company secret because of the conflicting 2 laws. So I will skip this. So we did also this very, very dry and technical stuff called Equivalence Assessment Matrix, which compares Mongolia's EI law with Asian Development Bank SPS policy, social safeguard policy, Asian Development Banks. So it just compares, and according to this matrix, so we did a little part, and ADB did the other part. So according to this study, Mongolia's CSS for environment is low, since it is found that Mongolian legal framework is fully equivalent with one of the 11 policy principles, with 8 of the 27 key elements of the ADB's environmental safeguard. So it's quite a pretty low score. So what does happen with environmental impact assessments in practice? So we examined like about 12, 13 different environmental protection plans, so which presents a very, very gloomy picture. Most of these plans are extremely general in nature, lacks an assessment of the risk-weighted consequences of various options in terms of both intergenerational equity and measures to provide appropriate compensation for the harm. So after the EI law was enacted, there were so many companies incorporated with it that were supposed to do the environmental impact assessment for the company, that it was about from personal example, there were 12 at least people from the ministry that gone out of their work, left their job and started this type of companies. But because of their scale, little scale, and absence of proficiency, it's just kind of and technical expertise, it resulted in very, very poor quality of EIAs and conflicts of interest because of their previous job and what they do right now at this moment of the time. So the last principle that tries to mitigate these different impacts is the impact on indigenous peoples. So in 2013, the International Council on Mining and Metals updated its position statement on indigenous peoples and mining, which requires its members to work towards a thing called FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent. So Mongolia, officially, Mongolia doesn't have indigenous people, but the pastoralists could come into this category because of this. According to this Forest Stewardship Council, the definition of the indigenous people was further broadened to include pastoralists that may not be physically close to the area, but depend on the area's natural resources seasonally or in times of hardship, which is classically a Mongolian case, because a herder needs at least 25 to 30 kilometers of grassland for pasture. How many minutes are left? Yeah. So as I've mentioned previously, some mining companies tend to view community engagement as a tool for managing their business risks and the risk of conflict with the community, rather than for managing risks to communities or contributing towards the social economic development of the community. This is especially pertinent to mid-level companies and small-level mining companies, because the multinational companies are bound to different treaties in different states, as well as bound to different international treaties, as well as bound to regulations from international financial institutions that provide credit, or institutions like MIGA, World Bank institutions like MIGA, which provide political insurance and stuff like that. So in terms of mid-level mining companies, as well as small-level companies, this quote makes especially very, very good sense. So the last part of the country safeguard systems concerns the involuntary resettlement of people. So Mongolia's law on land allows the state to acquire privately possessed land through negotiated settlement or confiscate land from the owners, if the owner uses land against the social and economic welfare of whole communities. So Article 40 of this law sets out all other violations where the state may confiscate land. So with regard to infrastructure development, which is especially pertinent to current Mongolian situation, land acquisition and resettlement issues are regulated only for construction of national scale infrastructure. And other projects like land acquisition and resettlement, projects that are not construed as national scale, will be achieved through agreements with affected landowners or possessors in accordance with the civil code. Both laws provide compensation to a certain extent. So what does this mean is that involuntary settlement is in practice, being settled between tripartite consultations between companies, the state level, municipality, and the people itself. So there were so many human rights violations that were reported by Amnesty International that concerns the Gir area redevelopment program. And there was a recent case that went to the state Great Hural, the Mongolian parliament, where actually about 120 something people were left without hot water and sewage system for about 2 years. So they complained and complained, and because these projects that are deemed not national scale grand enough are regulated in very, very ad hoc basis, which are presenting so many problems right now. So concluding the involuntary resettlement part, so contents of the domestic laws contradict in several circumstances with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, such as the prohibition of forced eviction, need of resettlement plan, legal assistance, monitoring, provision of adequate housing with security of tenure, provision for vulnerable groups, and these are not addressed in relevant laws, or if addressed, they are not properly coordinated between laws. So these are, the previous slides concerned the country safeguard system mechanisms that international financial institutions like ADB or EBRD do before they do a project. So there are also grievance mechanisms that can be used by different citizens or communities. So these include judicial mechanisms, for example, the judicial system of Mongolia, the court system. But they are quite, in a sense, weak in addressing specialized cases, such as those related to mining, environment, and human rights. Moreover, laws and regulations might not be coherent enough to provide the basis to make a claim. So basically, the process drags out and drags out if you go through the judicial system. The next step would be state non-judicial grievance mechanisms, such as use of ombudspersons or institutions like the human rights. Human Rights Commission, yeah. And some human rights commissions around the world are accredited with this type of credentials that they can address different grievances. So, and then what is left is company-based grievance mechanisms and third-party grievance mechanisms. And these are often the only remedy accessible in rural and remote areas where mining operations are being conducted, because the process is quite streamlined, easier, and it is, for example, herders from, if I remember correctly, Tutelage were able to address the grievances to International Financial Corporation's grievance mechanism. Yeah, Hamburg. And then they were able to actually get some types of compensation for their supposed loss. But IFC addresses this because they sometimes provide credit or they provide institutional support, right? In terms of technical assistance projects and stuff like that. But the companies would probably say it is enhancing democracy at the local level, and the officials at the local government would probably agree with that, because people are addressing their grievances, they are getting their compensation. So what is the problem? So for me and for our study team, the problem was actually the democratic decision-making was actually going from being uprooted from the community itself and going straight to offshore and faraway places like the IFC, which is kind of not really addressing addressing the democracy deficit issues at the local level, but probably perpetuating some inequalities at the local level. So I will try to conclude my speech with 3 different layers. So I would try first to actually reorganize and reconfigure the definition of governance, because it is totally inadequate to address only environmental governance. Because if you have economic governance and political governance mechanisms imbued and included within the political system, within the nation state, it makes seeing these parts in separate spheres, first of all, inadequate, and second, totally implausible. Because, for example, law on foreign investment, and such as in treaties like bilateral investment treaties, Mongolia signed with about 40 countries, and major investment projects like Oyutogo or WTO commitments and similar commitments come with de facto power that actually reconfigures the power balance in the country. And for example, the Oyutogo deal will become the standard investment agreement for that type of big projects. The bilateral investment treaties and disputes, investor-state dispute settlements would decide the precedents at the international legislature and the international arbitration courts. So this is from one side, if we see Mongolian governance as a pie, it's kind of overlapped or overstepped or completely overdone by different international agreements that de facto have a very, very high power, and which actually makes talking about domestic and environmental governance or economic governance very superficial. So investment dispute settlement agreements allow corporations to sue countries and governments. We saw with this example with Hun Resources versus Canada case. And the investment agreements also bind countries to actually, for example, I will tell one example. How does international trade treaties as well as investment agreements subserve policy space available to countries like Mongolia? If a country, if a local government or national government comes to maybe a company, maybe a mining company, for example, from Australia, and if Australia has a bilateral investment treaty with Mongolia, they can sue any type of regulatory advance from the country as type of expropriation. And it could be sent straight away to international arbitration courts, which is kind of really makes state sovereignty at all levels very, very shaky and superfluous in some senses. So my next conclusion would be just about environmental governance and its state in Mongolia right now. So very, very specific problem includes, and it's actually repeats the points of Mr. Hanum. These points include structural and procedural deficiencies, poor government administration of the environment, inadequate institutions, lack of effective community participation, failure to prepare environmental law around the sensitive ecological environment, which is in decline from increasing degradation of water, soils, and vegetation, expanding desertification, increased water, air, and land pollution, loss of biodiversity, species decline, and ecosystem dysfunction. So this concerns only the environmental governance and its effects in Mongolia. So I would say there are a couple levels of recommendations to Mongolian government: streamline and strengthen Mongolia's environmental legislative framework, strengthen environmental governance oversight over institutions and its mechanisms, as well as strengthen the capacity of non-government organizations and civil society organizations to engage in environmental governance processes. So just coming over from this conclusion and talking about even bigger picture, my conclusion is that because of the processes that was happening in 1990s and Mongolia's transition itself, the normative legal structure, Mongolia's normative legal structure lacks a balance between rights and obligations. Governance system is inefficient and doesn't have necessary capabilities to implement laws and regulations. And the balance between rights and obligations is, if a state has a capacity, it has a capacity to actually coerce different private actors as well as different international actors to actually do their mandates, right? So this imbalance between what Mongolia has practically many laws in a formal sense, but when you include the state capacity into the picture, it lacks just very, very well in many senses. So I said about neoliberal government before, right? And neoliberal governmentality in a theoretical sense. The postulation by Foucault was actually that he was talking about the entrenchment of state from different legal as well as social obligations and giving it to market and private actors. Basically the obligations of the welfare state that was consolidated in mid-20th century. So the new types of, and because these international private actors, mining companies were prone to so much criticism in 90s and 2000s, they had to change their approach, and the current approach is called the social development model, which includes all the things, the participation, the consultation, and stuff like that into the social development model of how a multinational company should operate in a country. But what is happening on the ground is that it is becoming a more subsumed type of neoliberalism, because new forms of political technologies such as citizen participation, civil society, and stuff like that It cannot be mistaken with opening up of political spaces of the countries, because these approaches are meant to manage investment risk at the local level. And Professor Pascal Hatcher and we will do another study in southern provinces probably next summer to actually explore this theoretical lens and configuration to confirm it or to configure it next year probably. So at the conclusion, I would like to say that maybe it's a very, very basic postulate, but a governance effectiveness is not only availability of different treaties, postulates, laws, procedures, bylaws, but the effective capacity of the state actually to manage those. Because if the state cannot manage it, it becomes even more counterproductive. Because, for example, you saw the country system mechanisms and EA and the complicated stuff, yeah? And if the state doesn't have the capacity to do that kind of complex stuff, but they are spending what little resources they have on these type of projects, trying to train people, train staff, and stuff like that, it just kind of diminishes the whole capacity, and it is more counterproductive than it was before, probably. So that is what I was trying to say for the whole presentation. And thank you for the attention.